Hi, everyone.
Hey, Carrie.
Hey, Carrie.
Hi, Kate.
Good to see you.
You too.
Where are you
So,
tuning in from, Kate? Are you in Vermont?
I'm in Vermont. Yeah,
do you guys
Didn't know if
have
you were traveling.
snow?
we do. We got a little bit of snow earlier this week, and we're supposed to get a bunch more Friday, Saturday. So,
Boy.
Nice.
Well,
All
I'm
right.
going to go ahead and get us started so that we can stay on track here. If people trickle in, that's fine.
Mhm.
So yeah, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm Carrie Browsick. I'm an agroforester here in Washington State and a co-founder of this work group, Agroforestry Northwest. And I want to welcome everyone to the last meeting of 2022. I would say it's been a good year. We've had some great guest speakers join us at our meetings this year, and we've had a great boost in our membership. So I think that this work group is growing into a really cool work group with a lot of potential moving into 2023. And I want to welcome Kate MacFarland from the National Agroforestry Center, who's joining us today to present to us. So thank you for joining us, Kate. And I want to say that we are moving into a new year soon. And now I'm getting some strange feedback, sorry. Okay, we're moving into a new year, and the Agroforestry Northwest board will be jumping right in January and starting to plan out the agendas for 2023. And so we love to hear feedback from all our work group members. So as we move into 2023, and as we start to plan out what we're going to do for the coming year, we would love to hear feedback from you all. Topics you would like to cover, ideas you might have, guest speakers that you might think would be great to speak to our work group. All of those kinds of ideas. We'd love to hear from you. You don't have to share it at a work group meeting. My contact information is on our website. So is Patrick's, so is Mark's. Feel free to reach out to any of us at any time with any kind of feedback that you all might have for making our work group better and having it serve you all as best that it can. So that is what I have. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Patrick to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And I just want to point out that we are recording this and it will be available if you want to watch it again, or if you have to hop off early, I'll put that on the website. And also, if anybody prefers to have the transcripts, the live transcript available, if captions helps you, just let me know in the chat box. I can turn that on, but otherwise I'll leave it off. But thank you all for joining us. We are joined by a very awesome guest speaker today, Kate MacFarland with the National Agroforestry Center. You know your job a lot better than I do, but I'll take a stab at it. She is responsible for a lot of outreach efforts around agroforestry nationwide. One of her roles is to support work groups like this. So we invited her to talk about some sort of, national trends in agroforestry and what the NAC, the National Agroforestry Center, is doing. So I will turn it over to you, Kate.
sounds great. I am going to go ahead and share my screen if that sounds good. Are you all? Oh, I didn't do that quite right. Sorry about that. Are you seeing that okay? Is it the correct presentation mode?
It is, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, I just like to verify because it's always tricky sometimes with different platforms and everything. It's so nice to talk with all of you. I'm really excited to see so many people participating and hear, I've gotten to hear, not participate as much as I would have liked to, but hear a little bit about what the work group has been up to and the conversations you're having. And I'm really excited to learn more because, as Patrick said, part of my role at the National Agroforestry Center is to sort of learn from and support anyone working in agroforestry across the country the best I can. And so I'm excited to, have some conversations as well at the end and sort of interaction and ideas and hear from you all. So I was asked to talk a little bit about what we do at the National Agroforestry Center, explaining sort of who we are and what we've been up to recently, because hopefully some of the projects are of interest to you and maybe overlap with your work, and that'd be really interesting to hear about. I was also asked to talk a little bit about USDA programs and thinking about how USDA programs can support agroforestry work. And I'll touch on other programs as well, just because we've been having a lot of conversations about that, and then wrap up talking about sort of themes I'm thinking about and we at the center have been hearing about in agroforestry. And I'd be so interested to hear if, you know, they're the same ones you all are talking about, or there's some overlap, or totally different ones are important in your work. So feel free to interject if you have questions. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, though it's a little tricky with the windows. Yeah. So our center, here's the website up top. We were authorized in the 1990 Farm Bill, and we're a partnership between Forest Service Research and Development, Forest Service State and Private Forestry, and the NRCS. We're a pretty small team, sort of integrated between the research side and the technical assistance and education side, which is the one that I mostly work on. Here you can see the staff currently. Like I said, a pretty small group of people. Let's see, you're bureaucratically part of the national office in Washington, D.C., but the center, for sort of interesting historical reasons, most of the staff, except our director, are based in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is where I was until a couple of years ago. And because Rich Straight and I sort of split the country between us geographically, we felt like it made sense for me to be based in one of the regions that I cover, which is the Northeast, as well as the Northwest. So I work out of a Forest Service office in Burlington, Vermont right now. Because we're such a small staff, but we still have this national scope of work. We do all of our work through partnerships. And so, you know, this comes up because we don't, you know, unlike some other parts of the Forest Service, we don't have staff at sort of research stations or regional offices. And we also, you know, there are some wonderful exceptions, but there aren't a lot of counterparts in state government either, really specifically focused on agroforestry. But working through partnerships has a lot of benefits, as we all know, right? Like that's why working groups exist, all of these different things. For our agroforestry work, I think we really benefit when we have expertise from different fields and also from sort of different sectors as well. And so we really appreciate getting to work in partnership with so many different people and different kinds of organizations around the country in agroforestry efforts. Our work is focused around these three focus areas: ecosystem services provided by agroforestry, understanding human dimensions of agroforestry, and promoting agroforestry education networks and support. And so I was just going to share a few examples of what this looks like. So on the ecosystem services side, we do some work really trying to understand how much agroforestry is out there. You'll see that sort of come up again and again because we sort of get at it through different kinds of projects. But this is an effort starting in the Great Plains, where most of the trees that are there, with some important exceptions, but are in riparian buffers or were planted for windbreaks or riparian buffers, really trying to understand what are these trees outside of forests. And these have really exciting implications because they're not picked up by the other inventory efforts that are out there, like FIA, the Forest Inventory Analysis run by the U.S. Forest Service. And what it has surfaced is there's a lot more trees in the Great Plains than we previously thought. And that has important implications for both allocation of federal funding to state forestry agencies, but also how those state forestry agencies are making decisions around their limited capacity for technical assistance and how to really make sure they're able to reach out to landowners that are really, their windbreaks are in need of renovation, those kinds of questions. We're also doing some research work looking at carbon storage capacity of silvopasture systems, really trying to compare silvopastures with treeless pastures nearby to do that comparison to really get stronger temperate numbers related to silvopasture and carbon storage. As many of you know, because you're wonderfully helping out with this effort, we're working on an agroforestry Silvex guide to better understand what species are used in different, what are some of the most common species used in agroforestry systems, and how are they used in different kinds of agroforestry practices. We've been pulled into interesting work led by the USDA on methods for greenhouse gas inventory, both at the farm scale, which gets translated into tools like Comet Farm that are then often used by policymakers when they're doing different kinds of climate-related work. When I think about our human dimensions work, it's one sector where the research side of NAC and the technical assistance side of NAC, as you might expect, come together really closely. Over the last few years, we've done some synthesis studies trying to look at, okay, we have all these sort of one-off studies around the country of how people like their windbreaks or don't like their windbreaks and what their challenges are. And so we try to look across all those different surveys and say, okay, what do they say in aggregate? And we learn, I think, really helpful things like, farmers are planting windbreaks primarily for those indirect economic benefits, right? The benefits to the crop yield, the benefits to livestock. People like their windbreaks, which we think we know, but then we have all these questions about. So it's nice to sort of see that reflected in the survey research. What some of the challenges are, as well as why people are not interested in planting windbreaks, which I think is really important to know as well. We did a similar study looking at silvopasture surveys, trying to understand why people are planting silvopastures, what challenges they run into, what's working, what's not working. And again, a lot of this is sort of validating stuff we know, but it's nice to look at it. It's really helpful to look at it in a national scale. And I think it's sometimes, some of the things that I find really useful is saying, hey, 98% of the farmers who are practicing silvopasture are using rotational grazing, right? We know that that's important to effective silvopasture, and it's nice to see that actually reflected in how people say they're doing it. And similarly, right, most people who have silvopastures haven't turned all their land into a set of silvopastures. They in fact use some combination of open grazing and silvopastures. Again, we know this experientially, but it's helpful to say, oh, okay, this isn't just like the people I know doing silvopasture, but it's true in the studies that have been done around the country. As related to these sort of social and economic dimensions of silvopasture, the land access question comes up a lot, right? We know so much land is rented out and operated by others across the US. And also, as people are trying to get into farming, land access is one of the biggest challenges. When we think about agroforestry systems, it's even harder, right? Because sort of an annual lease will not get you very far if you want to plant trees. And so just trying to learn more about sort of how can we approach that in agroforestry, and also like what are some of the interesting solutions people have come up with, whether it's like separating the trees and the crops and doing interesting rental payments that way, or just trying to learn from people who have done it before. We were also able to put out a survey to people who are practicing agroforestry. So the 2017 Census of Agriculture, which goes out to all farms that make or usually make $1,000 a year, had one question related to agroforestry, whether farms are using agroforestry. And maybe to my surprise, 30,000 farms across the US said yes to that question. To put in a little bit of context, about 18,000 farms said that they are organic farmers. So not to put those against each other, but just for a sense of scale. We were able, thanks to funding from other USDA agencies and cooperation with the National Ag Statistics Service, put out a survey to 11,000 of those 11,000 farms that said yes to that question, to really learn more about what those agroforestry practices are. Because right, it's so basic, but we don't really know how many people are practicing agroforestry, what that looks like, what practices are they doing, what tree species are they using, what are their challenges. And so we're so excited about the results of this survey really being helpful for groups like this one to say, okay, farmers' biggest challenge with silvopasture systems is fencing. Okay, let's talk about that in terms of funding, in terms of technical assistance, all these different things. I just made up the fencing. We don't actually have the results yet, but like, I'm just so excited to sort of see the results of that just for information. But I think it really has exciting impacts in all of the work that we do in this technical assistance, professional development, and coordination work. We also get to partner on some cool projects to really start to dig into the economics of agroforestry, which is, I know, the first question I get a lot of the time from farmers and landowners, to better, I don't think we can always have, right, all business planning is never perfect, but just have the numbers to be able to supply better information to farmers related to business planning. And so through a conservation innovation grant that's led by Appalachian Sustainable Development, we've been working on this forest farming calculator that's helping people at least get those sort of back of the envelope numbers related to like the inputs to developing forest farming systems, the management costs of those forest farming systems, including people's labor, which people tend to undervalue in forest farming, I would say. And then what you can expect for prices, or what you need to ask for prices in order to make the business work. So that's been really neat to get to work on. And we've got some other sort of calculator tools like that for different agroforestry practices. In our education work, this is another one where we definitely learn from and work with the researchers at our center in terms of using their research and making sure that the trainings that we put on are really sharing our best knowledge about how agroforestry systems work. But this is one where the partnerships that we have are so important. So we get to work with people all over the country who are interested in leading workshops and training related to agroforestry. I think this is really, really important. And I know you all think about this a lot, but I just think this is so key to advancing agroforestry, right? Like the question we hear come up so much, and this was reflected in those silvopasture and windbreak synthesis studies we did earlier, is I'm a landowner or I'm a farmer and I'm interested in doing agroforestry and I can't find anyone to help me do that work. I go into my XYZ office, my, all extension, conservation district, NRCS, this is not knocking anybody. And so often, right, those of us who are trained in natural resources and trained in agriculture didn't actually take agroforestry courses in school, don't have a lot of support for that within the different programs that we administer. And so there's just a big question mark when they go to get technical assistance. And so I think our role collectively as an agroforestry community is really to help increase that availability of agroforestry information to those people who are working directly with farmers and landowners to make decisions and implement these agroforestry practices. So that's a big piece of our work, and I think it has some good outcomes, but this is comes up in the sort of theme section at the end, but I think we are getting so many questions related to how do we scale this up, and how do we also like provide not just introductory training, but really that I don't know, call it advanced, but like, okay, it's all well and good to get through agroforestry definitions and even start to talk about what it can look like in a specific region, but like, how do we help people gain the knowledge that they're confident going on a farm and actually planning out a practice? So I'd love to talk more about that. Another piece of our outreach and education work is related to publications. We find that a lot of people still find it really, really helpful to have print publications to leave with people, to hand to people when they're doing visits to farms to talk about agroforestry for a whole variety of reasons, whether it's because people don't have great access to the internet, or it's just because it's like an easy reminder, or it's nice to have a colorful brochure that can go with the program information. So we still develop a lot of publications that are really trying to reflect the best research that we have and provide them at no cost to people across the country who have use for them. So you can go on our website and order publications, and we mail them out to you if they're helpful. We're also always looking for help updating these, because there's a lot of older publications that have been developed at the center over over the last 30 years that have really good information in them, but need to be updated to reflect newer research, newer experiences, and more regionally specific information. Another piece of our work is really trying to help support the integration of agroforestry into other USDA programs and agencies, right? So most of us are US Forest Service employees. We're a partnership with NRCS, and a piece of our work is really getting that agroforestry information, within our own department, right, across USDA, to have staff who understand what agroforestry is and who think about it, how it can be advanced through either existing or new programs that are developed. Some of the work we've been doing recently is we were able to receive some funding through NRCS to develop to work with partners on agroforestry outreach projects. So these are developing sort of regionally specific and practice specific information about agroforestry and turning them into fact sheets and videos and case studies, just to, I'll be curious to hear if you all are running in this too. So often what people are looking for is like, what does agroforestry look like where I am? Where are there local examples? Can I really see somebody doing this near me? And so we're trying to just develop a bigger library of that kind of information. Yeah, So videos, there's some enterprise budget work being done there too, which I think will be helpful to learn from. Another important part of our agroforestry technical assistance and outreach work is related to partnerships for tribal and indigenous agroforestry. Mostly we've been doing this through partnering on different kinds of projects. So one with Blackfeet Community College, one with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and one with a really interesting healthcare center in Hawaii that also has a 100-acre agroforest that they've been managing for a long time. And some of the food, anyway, food goes into the hospital. It's really fascinating, but that's one piece of our agroforestry outreach work. We also get to be involved sometimes in review of NRCS conservation practice standards, just trying to do that key piece of taking more recent research and making sure it's integrated into how the standards are written. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I talked through sort of some of the work we're doing at the Agroforestry Center, but talking about sort of where and how agroforestry shows up across USDA. I thought I'd start with this ridiculous organizational chart that sort of shows all of USDA, which is, hard to read. And there's a lot of agencies at USDA. And I mean, I think it's like 100,000 people. So, right, that's a ton of different people to think about, us naively wanting to increase awareness of agroforestry across USDA. But one of the ways that we do this is there's a agroforestry executive steering committee and interagency agroforestry team, which of course have lots of acronyms, but it's a way to bring together employees from the Farm Service Agency, NRCS, the Ag Marketing Service, the Forest Service, the Ag Research Service, the National Ag Statistics Service, and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. So those are the agencies that really participate in these groups, to have at least a point person or a few point people at each of those agencies who know about agroforestry, at least know who to ask questions of. So over the years, that group has done some sort of high level things like coming up with an agroforestry strategic framework for the entire department. So that's not just related to what we at the National Agroforestry Center should do, but instead coming up with sort of like goals for all of USDA within the topic of agroforestry. I mention this mostly because we've heard from partners that sometimes a helpful resource when they're doing their grant writing related to agroforestry, especially if it's a USDA grant, right, to say this is advancing, some of the goals laid out in your own strategic framework. This group over the years, or these groups over the years, have also done things like creating a departmental regulation on agroforestry, which is a pretty bureaucratic step, but it lays out an actual definition of what agroforestry is so that other agencies can write programs that say, can refer to agroforestry and have a consistent definition. They also did this really amazing comprehensive review of USDA support for agroforestry. This was done 10 years ago, so unfortunately it's pretty out of date, but went through, agency by agency, program by program, saying what is being done, how much of your money, how much of your program support is actually going towards agroforestry. They also wrote a really neat guide to USDA agroforestry research funding opportunities, really trying to identify those that have been used or could be used for agroforestry. They did a brochure on marketing agroforestry products, trying to share case studies of, again, how we use some of these programs to advance sort of the rest of the supply chain for agroforestry, and then came out very recently, just this year, with this agroforestry across USDA agencies, which again tries to show sort of how different USDA programs have been used for agroforestry. But it's tricky, right? We had this newsletter for the 2014 Farm Bill, so it's, the information in it isn't super relevant, but I just like the image because I do feel like sometimes it's hard to find agroforestry and Farm Bill programs. We have a few like EQIP that actually name specific agroforestry practices, but many don't. And so this is a sort of living document that the Ag Marketing Service puts out, and it's focused on the local food supply chain. And as we know, agroforestry is not just supporting local food, but all different kinds of supply chains. But it's a really helpful USDA document because these are all hyperlinks to the actual program pages. And I really appreciate how it sort of thinks through what are the programs that support conservation or establishment, what are the programs that support production, production on farms, what programs support processing, what programs support aggregation distribution, and what programs are there to think about markets and consumers. And so it's super overwhelming, but I'm going to talk through it a little bit because I think it's helpful to remember when we think about how we look to USDA for support for agroforestry, that we think about that whole supply chain. I think I get a lot of questions related to the establishment piece, and that's really important, but it's also, we're not going to solve this by only establishing agroforestry. We need to be thinking about where all these products are going to go. So I also wanted to mention that right now, to try and get at these really important questions, we have a webinar series that started in September and it'll go through June of 2023. It's the first Friday of every month at noon Pacific. And it pairs a speaker from the USDA agency that the webinar is about with a participant who's used that program for their agroforestry work. So trying to share the basics of the program and then share somebody's experience with actually using it and asking those questions like how hard is the reporting, and can you get an extension, and what if something goes wrong? Just trying to show, yeah, anyway, so those are all recorded. Only we're working on getting all the recordings of the past ones on our website, but they should be up there soon. And yeah, like I said, they'll go through June. So I think often when we talk about, when I get questions about how does USDA support agroforestry, people want to know about how EQIP can support agroforestry, the NRCS Environmental Quality Incentives Program, because I think because that program, uses the practice names, that's what people are looking for. People also think pretty frequently of the CRP program, right? And those are both important for sure. But I think it's also really important to think about some of the other, I think some other programs sometimes get overlooked. And I think thinking about how we use the conservation stewardship program, which rewards people who are already doing good work on their operations, how we use conservation innovation grants, and some of the other programs that are out there to advance our agroforestry work. When I think about these, when I get these questions related to EQIP, I think it's really an opportunity. If you're looking for more support from EQIP for agroforestry in your state, and I'm thinking there's probably folks from Washington NRCS and maybe other state NRCS offices on here. What I hear when I get to work with state NRCS offices across the country on sort of advancing agroforestry, the key steps are really making sure that you're engaging with your state technical committee, with the forestry subcommittees, and the local committees to really share information, what you're hearing in your jobs about producer interest in agroforestry, and what, help give that information about what are the real resource concerns in your area and how those may or may not be addressed through agroforestry practices. I also thought I'd share that right now there's a Federal Register notice open on how USDA and NRCS should implement the Inflation Reduction Act funding that came in. And so that's open through December 21st. So that's another place where if you can share your thoughts on that, the EQIP, the CSP, they're all listed in the Federal Register notice, but a variety of different programs and sort of how NRCS should use that funding to advance I think it's framed specifically around climate smart activities and systems, but advance the work that they're doing. I also thought I'd mention, getting to work with NRCS for so long, what I am increasingly hearing is that another thing to keep in mind is, right, again, NRCS does offer EQIP, and that's really, really important. Also, it can be really effective to use the Conservation Innovation Grant Program to really demonstrate what an agroforestry practice can look like in a state or region, then use the RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which sort of sets aside EQIP funding to really advance a specific project with a bunch of partners. That really can help demonstrate that there is landowner interest in those practices, and that sort of helps a state or region or local area see that there will be landowners who will actually apply for the practices if they offer them through EQIP, or I should have put CSP or some of these other programs on this slide too. So that's just sort of like a pathway that I'm increasingly hearing is beneficial. And I know it's slow, but it's also an opportunity to sort of develop more partnerships in agroforestry in our region, develop those landowners who are already doing it or might be interested in doing it. So just that I saw that, because when I look at all of the programs that NRCS offers, or I hear from the agroforestry community, it's sort of like, well, which one do I apply for when? And so I thought it would be helpful just to sort of share that potential pathway. I also think one that people may be less aware of is the Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Production. This was just established in the 2018 Farm Bill, and it's really attempted to focus on the needs of urban and sort of community farmers. It does a lot of different things, but one of the things that it does is really support, it has a series of competitive planning and implementation project funding. It's really different than a lot of other USDA funds in that it can actually be used for land purchase, which I've never seen before. And they very specifically write urban agroforestry, sort of food forests and urban orchards into their sort of RFPs, into their notices of funding opportunity. And I didn't list all of them, but these are just some of the different sort of urban agroforestry related projects that have been funded just in the last 3 years that grant program has been going on. When I look at sort of across that supply chain diagram that I showed before, we see other programs like the Local Food Promotion Program, the Rural Business Development Grants and Value Added Producer Grants, all of which have really been used to advance our agroforestry work. And so again, thinking about that processing step, which so many of sort of tree fruits and nut crops need, but also other crops need that might be part of agroforestry systems, can be really key. And we have some great examples of sort of how people have used these programs to sort of think about that step in advancing their agroforestry work. And then at the aggregation and distribution, that sort of column too, I know some of you all on this call are involved in specialty crop block grants. I think they can be really helpful for these crops that we're including in agroforestry systems where we have questions related to well, just lots of questions related to them, right? And whether it's to production, aggregation, to distribution, to marketing. And so when I look at some of the programs that are really helping advance agroforestry, I think those specialty crop block grants can really be helpful. And coming up in April, we've got a speaker talking about the multi-state specialty crop block grants. So that's a little bit different than the ones issued through the state departments of ag, but I think it's a neat example of sort of how those can work. On the research side as well, I think that's sort of a different cycle to think through, making sure we're supporting the whole thing. As I mentioned earlier, this guide to USDA agroforestry research funding opportunities was a real attempt to try and summarize that research funding that's out there from USDA and how it can be used for our agroforestry work. There's examples through the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, and we actually had a webinar just at the start of this month related to an example of how that's been used for some agroforestry work in Oregon. I guess you all are quite probably aware of how the SARE program has been such a key supporter of agroforestry research and education work over the years. Because it's been so important, a few years ago we created this sort of index on our website that we try to aggregate all of the SARE funded projects that are related to agroforestry, because I find so often that when I get a question related to what's going on in agroforestry in my area, or what could silvopasture look like in my area, it can be so useful to look to those SARE grants, which have funded so much great agroforestry work in almost every state, just as a starting point to see, has a farmer looked at this already through a SARE grant? So I find that a great resource, but it can be helpful for a sort of wide variety of reasons. And we also had, through this webinar series, had both a webinar on the SARE Farmer Rancher grants and sort of how that was used to support agroforestry, as well as a research and education grant. When I think about, sometimes I get a lot of questions about what states could be doing or what states are doing, and also local government, all different kinds of programs to support agroforestry. And this is one where it'd be interesting to sort of hear your all's experience in Washington and other states in the Northwest, because I think, I don't know, there's a lot of great discussion here. I guess I thought I'd share, a few years ago, we were able to work with a student who did a project looking at state soil health policies around the country and trying to say, how can we use, more and more states are coming up with different kinds of soil health policies that sometimes create grant programs, sometimes create different kinds of incentives for farmers to practice, to implement different kinds of practices or to have different kinds of outcome related to soil health. And Kara Hoving did this great project trying to look, it was done in 2020, so it's a couple years out of date, but trying to say, okay, in the states that have different kinds of soil health programs, do these allow for agroforestry, or do they promote agroforestry, or do they exclude agroforestry? Because sometimes those aren't the first practices that come up when people don't always, agronomists who often develop soil health policies, this is no insult to agronomists, don't always think of tree-based practices for lots of good reasons. And so just trying to better understand if there are states that are doing really exciting things to help have more support for agroforestry through these soil health policies. And so what she found was, I mean, in my opinion, more states than I expected really either lend direct support to agroforestry, naming specific practices and saying windbreaks reduce soil erosion and support soil health, or they're more general and sort of talk about perennial plantings or talk about managed grazing, these kinds of things. When I think about other state and local policies and programs, one thing that comes up for me is thinking about a few years ago, Pennsylvania started a multifunctional riparian forest buffer program that they specifically designed to sort of complement and target different landowners than the federal Conservation Reserve Program, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, and EQIP programs. So I just thought it was really interesting to think about developing a state program that can get at, they were really trying to get at people who wanted to plant these buffers that you can harvest from, and who might not have been, or who were not interested in participating in the sort of the conservation focused programs that the federal government offers at this time. So that was an interesting example. We've also been working for the last few years on some work with NC State, North Carolina State University, looking at state preferential tax programs. So sometimes they're called current use, or these different programs where you get a lower tax rate if your land is classed either agricultural or forest land. But sometimes the definitions that states have for either ag or forest land can exclude agroforestry, right? Like your ag land can only have X number of trees per acre, or your forest land, cannot have grazing in it, or cannot have non-timber forest product harvesting in it. And so that I hear about that as a barrier to agroforestry fairly often, as saying I would do this, but then I lose my ability to participate in the state tax program. And so with NC State, we've been doing sort of a researchy project to really look at how that differs across different states. So they did a pilot project a few years ago, looking at North Carolina, New York, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Oregon, and their tax programs and how they either support or hinder agroforestry adoption. And that's now being expanded to try and look at all 50 states and really better understand that landscape and sort of which state tax programs really support agroforestry or hinder agroforestry. But I'd love to hear about other sort of state and local policies and programs that you all are hearing about, or I don't know if that's a topic that people are discussing. It'd be really interesting, to discuss that further. So finally, I just wanted to share a little bit more about sort of other themes in agroforestry that we're hearing about. And again, I'd be so curious to hear if this resonates or doesn't resonate and what you all are thinking. I feel like the demand for training just keeps increasing, which is really exciting. It's both coming from landowners, farmers, forest managers who are really trying to say, how do I do this on my place? I want to attend a training and then bring it back to my place. But also that advanced training for ag and natural resource professionals who, in order to better provide assistance on these topics. And often, I think there are, we've got a webinar library on our website because there are a lot of fantastic webinars that are really important. I think it's important that we continue offering different sort of those introductory trainings and field days and that kind of thing. But I also think there's additional training that's really needed to get beyond that introductory training so that people are really comfortable talking through like the specifics and saying, yeah, go ahead and plant these trees, with farmers, and really getting into the details of species and spacing and challenges and letting people know from the beginning that it's not, it's not all good, right? Like everything is trade-offs. And so there are challenges here. And so we'd love to think more about sort of how we provide that kind of training, what people are looking for in that kind of training, format questions, logistical questions, funding questions, but it's just such a big topic. Another one that I keep hearing about, and I'd love to hear about if this is coming up in your region too, is just the availability of plant materials challenges. So, you know, it feels like through all of these different, anyway, it feels like there's a lot of interest in agroforestry, and that's all well and good, but like the first bottleneck I feel like we run into is that availability of plant materials. And that's a mixture of like getting to access them at all, getting to access at a price that is actually reasonable, the availability of, you know, the genetic resources we want, right, the right varieties that are high yielding, that are adapted to a specific climate, that are easy to harvest, you know, all the different components that we want that make them different sometimes than conservation grade seedlings. But also those conservation grade seedlings are in high demand too. So how do we manage all of that? And, you know, at our center, we've been lucky to be pulled into some sort of USDA wide work going on this. In June, Secretary Vilsack released a memo related to climate resilience, climate resilience and carbon stewardship. And coming out of that, USDA formed a strike team on reforestation, afforestation, and agroforestry. And a piece of that work is really looking at nurseries and plant material availability, not just at, I mean, and agroforestry is a tiny component of that, but also looking at larger issues of sort of like post-fire restoration, all sorts of big questions. But we're trying to really advocate for agroforestry and agroforestry nurseries and plant materials needs being part of that conversation. But again, it's what I'd love to talk with you all about some more, because it's increasingly a big part of my life. I also keep hearing about, right, we have some research sites out there, but everybody wants to see more research on agroforestry. And so how do we think really intentionally about asking, you know, designing experiments well, setting up replicated experiments, and thinking about sort of how do we think about a network of agroforestry research across the country so that we can do some, I don't know, I think those kinds of comparisons can be useful. And I hear about a real interest in research, not just in the agronomic and ecological questions, which are so important, but also in the economic questions, right? Like, how do we make sure we're keeping track of what it takes to establish these research sites, and social questions too. So that comes up. And then, you know, really, I've been increasingly trying to, in my mind at least, separate research from demonstration, even though obviously there's lots of incredible on-farm research that happens, and there's lots of demonstration that can happen at research sites. But thinking about how we use research sites, and a real interest in seeing research sites that are taking place on working farms, not just in abstract where people don't need to make money. So I'd be curious to hear what you all are hearing about that. And then the climate piece just keeps coming up, right? So that often is the lens these days where funding and support for agroforestry is happening, whether it's through the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities, these Inflation Reduction Act funds that are going towards specifically, wow, that is a lot of acronyms I put in that bullet, sorry, but going specifically towards climate smart ag and forestry, right? That was what that Congress directed those funds to go towards through that Inflation Reduction Act. And USDA funds, that climate piece comes up again and again. And yeah, so that has certain implications for the way we're doing our work. So that's what I had to share with you all. I put my email and our website up here in case you want to reach out or see some of those resources, but I will stop there so that hopefully we can have some good discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate. That was great. And just want to reiterate again how grateful we are for you taking time to talk to us about this. Oh, of course,
anytime. I love getting to talk with you, so I'm always, yeah.
Great. Well, then we'll probably call your number again.
Yeah, I'd like to just listen in sometimes. I just haven't been able to make it work with those schedules, but.
I know I have a bunch of questions, but I don't want to hog time. So I feel people should absolutely continue to type into the chat box or unmute yourselves too. I mean, this is discussion based. This could be a round table. So feel free to chime in. We did get one question early on in the chat box from Suzanne. She asked if the agroforestry calculator that you mentioned is restricted to East Coast numbers and products, or is there West Coast stuff in there as well?
Yeah, so the forest farming calculator that I mentioned, we're still working on it, so it's not out yet. It is focused on even more specific than East Coast, like appellation numbers because that's where the funding for the grant came from. So we're doing it on the context of this conservation innovation grant, and that's sort of where the input numbers from farmers is coming from. However, one thing we're really careful to do when we design our design these calculators is they're intended to allow for user input, right? So none of them are saying you will definitely be, having this % survival, right? It's a toggle that you can take the % survival based on the conditions or that you experience. And so I guess that's to say, I think could be pretty easily adapted, or it would be great to work together on adapting them for West Coast, both species and also sort of like conditions in terms of cost inputs and yield and prices and all those important questions. And so, yeah, unfortunately, right, the consequence, like so many of us, like we're doing this in the context of a particular grant, so it's pretty focused on the outcomes of that grant. But I really am hopeful that it'll be adaptable. And, we have a similar, we got to work with Virginia Tech, gosh, more like 8 years ago it's on our website as a non-timber forest products calculator, but that's probably the wrong term because it's really trying to look at, a multifunctional riparian buffer and sort of what could you estimate there. And I know, that again, it was grant funded through a different conservation innovation grant with the state of Virginia. So even more specific. So, it's like pawpaw and elderberry. It's a very specific set of species. But I know I've talked with people who have just used the shell of the calculator. It's an Excel-based tool, and then substituted in completely different species, but they've used it to be able to say, okay, this is the spacing, these are the prices I want, that kind of thing. So it's right. It's far from perfect, and I wish we had those calculators for every region, but yeah, hopefully we could work together to adapt it for the West.
Yeah, all in due time, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It sounds like Suzanne had another question. Feel free to unmute if you'd like, Suzanne. Or was that just a clap symbol, or was that a raising hand symbol? I can never figure out.
Right. Thanks, Patrick. Actually, it was clapping hands because I love it when things can be kind of adapted for an area like that. Sometimes these tools are built so specific that they're not adaptable. And that's pretty much what my question was. Is this going to be eventually adaptable? And it sounds like that was taken into consideration. So kudos and thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it would take a little bit of work, but it would be exciting to do for sure.
I'm kind of curious, in your presentation, you mentioned the Oregon Woodland Co-op is doing an Oregon grape project, and I've not heard anything about that.
So that might be a little bit, I was trying to just give examples of organizations that have used that grant program, and it's pretty old. It was like 10 years ago at least, but we have a little case study written up that I can send you. And I, like so many things, it was sort of like a one-off grant, and hopefully it's been helpful to them, but it was a pretty old one.
That would be great. I would definitely be interested in that.
Yeah, I'll send that over. It's in that really long summary of all of the USDA support to agroforestry in 2011 and 2012. So I think it's like a 2011 or 2012 grant, but I'll send you the summary for sure.
And Heidi also asked if we could get copies of the slides from today.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That'd be great. I can send those out to the group later.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll send you the PDF after.
Does anyone else have questions for Kate? Otherwise, I can keep asking my questions. Give it a few seconds. Well, one thing I was curious about, as you were giving your presentation, I remembered that a couple years back, the National Agroforestry Center offered it was sort of a small grant to develop, I'm trying to remember, I think it was kind of like case studies, basically go around and visit operations and then develop like small case studies. And it feels like forever ago. I want to say it was back, I heard about it back at Corvallis at the last AFTA meeting there, but is there any chance that the NAC will be renewing that grant? Because I think those case studies are such a great way to show, like what you said earlier, this is what agroforestry looks like.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel we're in a funny situation where by now we expect it to like be sharing them and that kind of thing. And as you'd expect, so that RFP went out in 2019, 2020, and 2021.
Oh, wow.
And as you'd expect, all of those projects, because so many of them involve farmer visits, were pretty delayed by COVID, right? I think almost every project we did a sort of no cost extension on the grants just because it was like, all sorts of plans got upended by COVID. So we're hoping to share those on our website, like in the new year, really soon. I have them like ready to go. We don't have a person who can do web design at our office anymore. So I have to sort of work through this back end of the Forest Service. So it's a little tricky, but on the question of whether we're going to offer it again, we didn't do it in 2022 and we won't in the beginning of 2023 because all this funding stuff. Anyway, the funding for that came through this NRCS initiative funding that there's like a hard stop. The funds disappear and expire at the end of fiscal year 2023, so September 2023. We're hopeful, we don't know yet whether we'll get another round of initiative funding that we would receive in 2023 sometime, and then we'd be able to offer it up in 2024. So to be determined, but we're hopeful. It's just, we're waiting to hear from NRCS.
Okay, that'd be great. It's such a, I know it's a small amount of money, but I think it has a really big impact to be able to produce something like that. Yeah,
I think people, I know more and more of those examples, even since 2019, when we first started offering that RFP and sort of, like you said, sort of saw that as a gap that we could, provide funding through NRCS to help fill. There's more examples out there, right? Like definitely more organizations, more universities, all sorts of people are developing those case studies and videos and that kind of thing. But I think there's still a need for it for sure. Like there's still a lot of areas and practices where there isn't enough information out there and people are saying, who's somebody near me who's doing that? I want to like actually see their farm. And of course it'd be better to see it in person, but a video can be, an introduction maybe.
Sure. So we did get a question. Brian asked, he's curious about urban forestry or urban agroforestry examples, probably is what he meant. Does the USDA have a partner in this area who may be linking agroforestry to food banks? And if there's any information about getting agroforestry in public schools or college campuses, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I know of any. There are so many amazing food forests out there, and some of them are, I think, have close relationships with local food banks. There's the first year that Congress put money to that new Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Production, it was one of those things where Congress didn't pass a budget until pretty late in the year, and so the Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Production didn't get the funding that they had to spend by the end of September until pretty late. And so we applied and got some of it for the National Agroforestry Center, just a small amount, and put out one of these RFPs for urban agroforestry outreach projects. It's a long backstory, sorry. One of the organizations that applied for that grant and received the funding is called Washington Parks and People, and they're based in Washington, DC. And the projects that they're developing, the case studies they're developing, are actually looking at existing school gardens that have been developed at grade schools, and looking at how schools have added trees to those school gardens to really think about the interactions there and sort of how those schools are using food forest and urban agroforestry concepts. I'll also mention that the U.S. Forest Service has an urban and community forestry program that has actually provided a good amount of, we have examples all over the country where they're really focused on forestry in general, not on agroforestry, but there's so much interest in food forests and urban agroforestry and urban orchards, and they've provided that support over the years. So there are examples there, and that's another organization or another part of the Forest Service that received, or of USDA that received a lot of funding in the Inflation Reduction Act, and so they are actually scaling up so many of their grant programs over the next few years, and so if people have more interest in those urban agroforestry topics, I'd encourage you to and I'm happy to share them with Patrick and others to share with all of you once we hear about them. None of these programs have been announced yet, but they're getting a lot of funding that will go somewhat, go through like all state and private forestry programs in the forest. Some of it will go out through state forestry agencies, but it's enough different funding that they're sort of taking a lot of different approaches to giving it away. And so there's going to be, I think there will be a lot of opportunities for sort of that urban and community agroforestry in the broadest sense through this program. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I just think that's something to keep an eye on because of the funding that came through recently. So
as a follow-up to that, is that another branch of government that's authorized to acquire property for that purpose, or just the branch that you were saying it's quite unique that the USD can acquire property for that purpose?
And to be clear, it's not USDA that's acquiring the property. It's the grantee is able to use some of the funding in that grant to do this urban agriculture, including urban agroforestry work. And no, my understanding is that, or at least in the past, the funds that have gone out through urban and community forestry have not included that purchase. That's the only time I've really seen it, besides like the forest legacy programs, these conservation easement programs, is through this Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Production grant programs, their implementation projects.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Kate? Okay. Carrie, did you have something?
No, not at the moment.
Sorry, I just saw you on mute. Well, okay, well then I guess we can call it there unless anyone suddenly thinks of something. But you know, we're at the hour here. We usually use the last half hour to kind of do a roundtable and share any announcements. But we can obviously continue this conversation. And Kate, you're more than welcome to stick around for this part if you'd like.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you again for your presentation. That was great. And like I said, I'll be sure to send out the slides and in the recording link later on. Carrie, do you want to kick us off with announcements?
Yeah. So if you're able to stick around with us and do some sharing, that'd be great. I do have one announcement that I do want to share. So for those of you looking at doing some agroforestry implementation, or those of you that might be working with some landowners that are trying to do some agroforestry implementation, we have the Washington State Sustainable Farms and Fields Bill through the Washington State Conservation Commission that has funding available now to do that type of work. So if you're not familiar with this bill, it is essentially funding farming practices that can show some type of carbon benefit. And of course, agroforestry really rises to the top when we're talking about farming practices that have a carbon benefit. So agroforestry practices for funding through this bill, it's just a really good opportunity, I think. And so if you're interested, I'll send out their announcement through the group. Maybe I'll have Patrick send that out to the group along with the slides from Kate's presentation. But it's funding that's available to lots of different organizations, not just like conservation districts, but lots of different types of folks. And there's one caveat that the money would have to be spent by June 30th. But if you're ready to implement something, or if you have a landowner that you're working with that's ready to implement something, this can be a really relatively easy way to get some funding to do some agroforestry in the next 6 months. So wanted to let everyone know about that.
Oh, well, Suzanne's got a question. Is the funding limited to specific practices?
There are all agroforestry practices listed in there, and all types of farming practices as well, like no-till or cover crops or things like that. But all the 5 major agroforestry practices are listed in there.
Just curious, So you mentioned the rank, there's like a ranking process. How long would it take from like application to getting the funding, especially like thinking about trying to plant trees like this winter?
So I will say that they had a first round that they did in early December or late November. They put it out in late November. And we submitted applications, and within a couple of weeks, they had notified you if you were going to get funded or not.
Oh,
so
nice.
That's the other thing, is the turnaround on this is super fast, because they recognize that they're giving you a very tight time frame to spend the money. So yeah, you apply, and then they turn it around pretty quickly, and then you know if you can go forth or not. And yes, partnering with a local conservation district, well, you don't have to. This funding's open to different organizations. If you're a conservation district, you can definitely apply. If you partner with a conservation district, yes, great. But if you are a private, you have to be a 501c3. They do have, there are some stipulations for who can apply, but I think like WSU Extension could apply. So it's open to various agencies, and you don't have to partner. And I don't think that's part of the ranking either, if you're partnered with a CD or not. I don't think that's a consideration. It's really mostly about the carbon benefits of the practices that you're wanting to implement.
I've had a few folks express interest in applying to that with us, and both for buying technologies. These folks on Vashon Island want to measure soil bacteria versus fungus with some sort of easy at-home probe test that I was trying to understand the efficacy of, but a lot of other people were just looking to get native plants to plant on their farms. And I was wondering how effective or how highly those types of applications would be ranked. If it's like a little 2-acre hobby farm on Vashon, someone wants some native plants, is that going to be worth our time? Maybe it's worth asking the commission, but what kind of grants did you see funded and not get funded?
So I've done some funding with different levels of agroforestry. Some were like riparian buffer type things that were smaller scale, like 1 acre, 2 acres. Some were like a 4-acre food forest planting. The cool thing about agroforestry is it tends to rank fairly well because you can show a pretty good carbon benefit. So one of the things you do when you apply is you run a carbon tool like Comet or another NRCS tool or the Washington State tool. And so agroforestry practices or planting trees, whether it's native or not native, tends to rank pretty high. Another tactic I've used too is to, if there are like 3 or 4 farms that are relatively close together, in a geographically close area, I'll lump them together and show their combined carbon benefit of these practices that they're going to implement. So that's another way that you can maybe be a little more competitive too.
That's super helpful. Yeah, the Vashon Island Growers Association blasted their community, and then a bunch of those people reached out to me. A lot of them want to do the same thing. So that's kind of the direction we were thinking. But you definitely have to have a site going in. You can't just say we're going to plant 10 sites or something.
No, you have to. These are kind of like shovel ready projects. Yeah, that these 5 identified farms are going to plant these, or they're going to implement these practices. Yeah.
Thanks.
Is there a funding limit?
There may be. I don't know what it is.
Okay,
I think, if we send that announcement out to everybody so that they've got the,
I don't know if you touched on Suzanne's follow-up question or not. She asked if there's a list of conservation districts that are already familiar with this funding. It sounds like maybe most conservation districts already are.
They should be. The Washington State Conservation Commission sent it out to all conservation districts. So there should be at least one person in every district that has seen this sort of funding request come out.
Okay. Awesome.
And any other announcements for the good of the group that anyone has? And if not, we can open it up to just, we love to use this time. If we realize that it's been an hour, we tend to stick around for another half hour to do some networking. So if you can stay with us, if you've got projects you're working on that you want to tell us about, if you've got questions you want to ask the group about, if you've got resources you want to share, new research about, any and all of that stuff, we kind of open the floor to just sharing at this point.
I'm happy to lead that discussion with you all. If somebody wants to just chime in or put something in the chat, feel free to go now. If there's a pregnant silence, it also might help if we have still 20 people on this group. If you haven't been on here before, or if your agency hasn't been on here before, feel free just to give us a heads up as to who you are and your interest in agroforestry.
Yeah, I can introduce myself. I apologize, I was a bit late. I had scheduling issues. But my name is Rachel Wood. I work at Cloud Mountain Farm Center up in Everson. So yeah, first time that our organization's at this meeting. But yeah, a lot of interest in agroforestry just between our retail nursery and our production orchard, and also our programming helping small farmers be sustainable. So happy to be here and make connections.
And then as people share, would you mind putting your contact information in the chat as well? Thank you. Hollis, go ahead.
Hey everybody, this is I'm Hollis Crapo. This is Eli. He's hanging out for a while, as long as he'll stay on my lap. Anyway, I'm with the DNR Small Forest Landowner Office. I am the Regulation Assistance Forester up for Northwest region, so Snohomish County on north to Canada. And I mean, most of what I do is helping folks kind of understand the rules and regulations, permitting process and things. But I've had an interest in agroforestry in Washington State kind of passively. And so as much as I can kind of absorb to help folks understand how that will fit in with their interests, as well as understand like how it fits in regulatorily, will also, it's a benefit, I think. And as far as I know, there's not many others with the DNR that have a particular interest. So yeah, I don't mind stepping into that.
Great resource. Thank you, Hollis. And Hollis, could you put your contact information in there?
Yeah, definitely will.
Working with DNR would be fantastic. Does anybody else want to speak up as to who they are and where they're from and any projects they're working on?
I can introduce myself first time on one of these meetings. My name is Alex Chacon. I'm a new forester with Mason Conservation District. New to Mason, new to Washington. This is my second week here. I'm coming from Southern California, where I worked with the Inland Empire Resource Conservation District as their forest health specialist. I also have a background in urban arboriculture through consulting utility forestry. Got my bachelor's degree in plant sciences at University of California, Santa Cruz. Great to meet all of you.
Glad to hear there's somebody from Santa Cruz here. Excellent. Anybody else? Don't be shy.
Hi, everybody. I can say hi real quickly. My name's Zach Spangler. I'm a Ag Climate Resiliency Specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension currently out in New York. But I am actually moving to Seattle shortly, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to get to know the agroforestry landscape is out there. And I really enjoyed hearing all of your updates and kind of getting to learn what you all are working on, and hopefully I'll be able to find something where I can continue this type of work out there.
Thanks, Zach. And please put your contact information if you feel okay sharing it in the chat.
Definitely will. Yep.
Zach, what are you moving into over in Seattle?
Not sure yet. My partner got a job out there, so I'm still looking for work. So
a free agent.
If you have leads, I'm a free agent. Yeah.
Well, I don't have anything in agroforestry, but if you ever want to step in with DNR, let me know and I can help direct you to resources and stuff for jobs.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Zach, Susan would also like you to reach out to her.
Yep, definitely will. Hi, Susan.
Great. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I'll just be real quick here. I'm Andy Bell, and I am on the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation board. Our board president, Brian Rail, is also part of this conversation. And we are currently, our agroforestry is our single main focus right now as a foundation. And we're working with Virginia Tech and Propagate and Agricultural Sustainable Development and Cornell. Those are our 4 partners, and we're looking to deepen our education and broaden our horizon and potentially maybe even look for an added consultant a little bit closer to home and somebody that's got more boots on the ground. So that's why I'm here. I think that's why we're here as a foundation, is just to deepen our own kind of education about this. So thank you all of you.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
And would you mind putting your contact in the chat?
Sure, I could do that.
Great, thank you. Any other takers? Thank you, Candace. Looking for work in this field. Her contact is in the chat. She's over in Kitsap County. Anybody else want to speak up, talk about a project they're all working on? Understand that people are dropping off, so just want to capture any other information that people are willing to share.
Well, I can shamelessly plug something quickly that is forest farming related. I recently started a citizen science program for big leaf maple tapping, trying to create a big leaf maple syrup industry here in Washington. And I will put a link into the chat there, but I just know we've got a lot of people on here that work with landowners, or maybe our landowners themselves, and may have interest in that. So I'll put that in the chat. And the basic idea is to utilize hobbyist tappers to collect data on how site quality and tree characteristics, that kind of thing affects sap yields. And we're calling it sap suckers. So
great name.
Yes. So I'll put that in the chat real quick.
And I will say we're also looking at doing potentially pending funding, of course. We're always, out applying for different grant resources, but looking for exploring more in the forest farming world here in the Pacific Northwest. So potentially looking at some grant resources for looking at, we find a lot of sort of degraded forest stands that are on farmlands that farmers kind of neglect and don't really pay a lot of attention to. So looking at some of those stands and how we could, through forest farming, increase the health of those forest stands while also showing that there could be some economic benefit for non-timber forest products out of those stands as well. So yeah, we're trying to collaborate on that. Yeah, so if there's any other projects or even desires or things that you all are wanting to work on that you want to throw out to the group too, this is a great forum to find collaborators as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to see also someone from a nursery being on here, because Kate mentioned that that plant material for agroforestry, getting crop materials, plant materials, certain species, certain cultivars is challenging across the US. I'm finding that that's challenging here. The more that we're trying to actually implement agroforestry on the ground at scale, finding those plant resources can be really challenging. So yeah, glad to have some nursery representation and that kind of thing as well in the group.
Yeah, happy to be here. And yeah, we're in an interesting spot just with like strategic planning. But this was definitely one priority that I would love to emphasize. And then in general, yeah, it's funny. I have an ag background, but also was in the conservation board for 2 years. So it's very interesting working with like restoration grade plants versus nursery grade, and just trying to find a happy medium that can hopefully fit the agroforestry sector. So
yeah.
And I also wanted to mention one thing that we've just been seeing a lot here is as land is changing hands, there's a lot of like abandoned orchards and other things that folks are trying to figure out what to do with, and if things are salvageable or not. So kind of echoing, you know, yeah, trying to increase the health of stands that are already existing.
That's great. To answer Kate's question, we have not had John speak to this group, though we've reached out to him for different research projects, but he would be great. Those of you that don't know who John Munsell is, he's with Virginia Tech. He's done a lot of work with riparian buffers and other resources that Kate mentioned.
Yeah, I just thought I'd mention the American Forest Farming Council piece, because he's really trying, you know, through the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition, he's tried to build those relationships between the buyer industry, the herbal, the medicinal buyer industry with forest farmers. And he's trying to sort of think about what that looks like. And he's done some traveling around to try and understand the forest farming communities in different parts of the country, but it could be really neat to sort of, on the funding piece and other pieces, connect with him and about what he's, not just what he's received, but sort of more broadly.
Absolutely.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
I have a question for Patrick. Is it WSU known for some focus on one specific modality of agroforestry, or just a little bit of everything?
I guess you could say a little bit. I mean, that's what extension always does, is a little bit of everything. But no, we don't even have anyone on staff necessarily that would be considered an agroforestry position. It's just sort of people in more traditional ag or forestry positions like myself that have agroforestry interests. I probably am the person at Extension that has the most interest in agroforestry, at least what I've found so far. So maybe I'm de facto the agroforester, but being a forestry background, I do tend to lean more towards things like forest farming and silvopasture, riparian buffers, that kind of stuff.
I would say, yeah, through this group, we've got sort of a great complement. Patrick really doing a lot with forest farming, Mark doing a lot with silvopasture, and then I'm doing a lot with riparian forest buffers and starting to do more with alley cropping. So I think, yeah, in our region, we're really starting to touch on a lot of the different agroforestry practices. Maybe windbreaks being one of the more neglected practices. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Historically, it's been talked about, especially here in Eastern Washington. Andy Burley through WSU Extension has put a lot of time and effort into windbreaks.
Yeah.
I also want to point out we have Sierra Young on the line, who's also with Extension and has significant agroforestry interests. Hey, Sierra.
Hi, sorry I was late. Was working on a few other things. I'm actually with the Jefferson County Conservation District.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know there's a different Sierra that's in the group that's with extension. Sorry.
That's okay.
It spells it the same way though. So. Sorry.
All right. Well, we've got just a few minutes left. Does anybody else have any thoughts or questions, or would like to share information with this group? This will be the last time we meet this year, but this conversation is going to continue ongoing. So if you don't get to say anything here, please know that we'll have the opportunity to connect in the future. Ryan, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just curious way back when, and forgive my naivete, but with the funding thing from the Washington Conservation Group, would that kind of funding typically include some sort of assurance for perpetuity, or just funding to get plants and trust that the people that are doing it are doing it for the right reasons?
It usually comes with, yeah, I mean, the main focus is sort of just getting that implementation done, but there usually is a landowner agreement that's attached with it that does sort of lock the landowner into maintaining that practice for a certain period of time. Typically it's 10 years, although we're working on trying to push that out for agroforestry practices. But yeah, that's where that's at. Although, yeah, that's an interesting area to be looking at, is some of that kind of, when some of these practices are implemented, what is the lifespan? How do you ensure the life, ensure that practice, especially when you're starting to tie it to carbon capture and that kind of thing. What does that look like long term on the landscape with particular landowners?
Yeah, and usually the insurance, sometimes the cost share thing is a good way to do it, because so they have skin in the game. Besides the, but yeah.
We actually, we did apply for funding that was going to look at that with a certain organization, but we weren't selected for funding. But yeah, that's another, there are a lot of puzzle pieces around agroforestry and implementation and climate change and all of that we're slowly starting to chip away on as a group. So if any of these areas particularly interest you, or any certain practices particularly interest you, or you're working with any of them, reach out, because there may be ways that we can collaborate on some of this stuff too. So.
Great. Well, I just want to remind everyone that our next meeting will be February 8th. We always do it the second Wednesday of every other month. So we actually don't have a speaker confirmed for that yet. But I'm sure it'll be a good one, whoever it is. And I hope you'll join us for that. And I hope we can all thank Kate again for joining us and giving that awesome presentation. And I will be sure to get that information out with the recording and some of the other resources we talked about today. Hopefully by the end of the week, if not early next week. But otherwise, I think we can call it there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone, it was so nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Okay.